twist story.
Everything at Willow's Steakhouse, a luxurious haven for the city's elite, was calm until a moment of indifference changed everything. A woman, appearing humble in her demeanor and modest in dress, sat at a quiet corner table. She waited. And waited. As the minutes passed, it became clear that the staff had decided she didn't deserve their attention. Her request, a simple one, was brushed aside with a quick dismissal, the waiter assuming she wasn't part of the restaurant's usual clientele. The room's atmosphere shifted, the tension palpable as others watched the exchange unfold. But what the staff didn't know. This woman was far more than what her appearance suggested. Before we dive into today's story, tell us, where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below. And if you enjoy stories that make you look at the world differently, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on more twists from Plot Twist Story. The sound of the doorbell echoed in the dimly lit atmosphere of Willow's Steakhouse, an upscale restaurant known for its elegant ambience and reputation for serving the elite of the city. The chandeliers above shimmered like stars in the night, casting soft pools of golden light across the leather booths and polished wooden tables. The scent of aged wine and rich, savory dishes filled the air, blending with the hushed murmur of high society conversation that filled the space. However, amid all the luxury and opulence, no one noticed Margaret Stone as she entered. Margaret, 70, was a woman of quiet dignity. Her silver hair, tied neatly in a simple bun, and her modest navy blue dress were in stark contrast to the glittering world around her. There were no lavish jewels, no designer labels, only simplicity and grace. She didn't need to flaunt her wealth. She had spent a lifetime building her empire in the real estate business, where she had earned her reputation, not through ostentatious displays of wealth, but through hard work, integrity, and an unyielding sense of justice. As she made her way toward the hostess stand, the soft click of her low heels on the floor barely made a sound, barely noticeable in the bustling atmosphere of the restaurant. Tessa Moore, a young, brash server in her mid-20s, glanced up only momentarily, before her eyes quickly returned to the glow of her phone screen. Her nails long, painted in bright hues of pink, tapped impatiently against the surface, betraying her obvious disinterest in the guest standing before her. Margaret, in her calm demeanor, waited patiently, and after a few moments, Tessa's eyes flicked up to her, narrowing with mild disdain as she took in Margaret's appearance, old, modestly dressed, perhaps not the kind of patron the restaurant was accustomed to serving. With a half-smile that suggested she already had her thoughts made up, Tessa finally spoke. "Table for one?" she asked, her voice thick with sarcasm. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Margaret's eyes met Tessa's with a quiet intensity. There was no anger in Margaret, only the calm confidence of someone who had seen the world and knew exactly what was at play. She didn't flinch, but her eyes, sharp and discerning, studied Tessa's face for a moment longer than necessary. "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice unwavering, "I am." Tessa sighed dramatically, clearly annoyed by the delay. She grabbed a menu, practically thrusting it into Margaret's hands with a lack of care. "Fine, whatever," she muttered, her tone dripping with disdain. "Sit anywhere in the back." Margaret's heart fluttered with a strange mix of disappointment and understanding. She had been in situations like this before, but she refused to let her emotions betray her. She calmly walked to the back of the restaurant, choosing a table near the dim lighting, where she could observe without being the center of attention. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, but she didn't let it affect her. The subtle air of judgment didn't bother her. It was just another test, another opportunity to remind herself that she had a duty to be more than the sum of her outward appearance. Time passed slowly. The other patrons around her were served promptly. Wine glasses were refilled almost before they had a chance to empty, and the servers were quick to provide them with recommendations and light-hearted conversation. Their tables, well-dressed and well-kept, were lavished with attention, while Margaret was ignored. She didn't mind the wait, though it had begun to wear on her. But what she couldn't ignore was the clear disparity in treatment. Patrons who had arrived after her dressed more lavishly were greeted and seated with grace, their orders taken within minutes. But Margaret sat alone, her table untouched, her water glass empty. She noticed that Tessa spent the majority of her time at the more prominent tables. Her demeanor changed when she approached those guests. She laughed, made small talk, and seemed eager to ensure that their needs were met. But when Tessa passed by Margaret's table, it was always with a quick glance and no acknowledgement. No greeting. No smile. Margaret had been a customer enough times to know that this was not how one should be treated in any respectable restaurant. She observed quietly, and with each passing moment, her frustration grew, but only in the way a fire grows slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it bursts into something more. She had seen this before, in different forms. People who believed that wealth was defined by what could be seen on the surface. People who judged the worth of others based on their clothes, their status, and their outward appearance. But Margaret was not some stranger. She had earned her place in the world. Another 20 minutes passed. Tessa walked past her table again, this time with the unmistakable air of someone who had decided Margaret was beneath her concern. She didn't even slow her pace as she muttered, "You sure you're okay? Or are you still waiting for your meal?" Tessa had no idea who she was talking to, but Margaret knew this was the moment where things would have to change. Margaret stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, controlled. Her calm exterior didn't falter as she approached the counter and requested, "Could I speak with the manager, please?" Tessa's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned to call across the room. "Hey, Danny. We got a situation over here." The manager, Victor Hayes, walked toward Margaret's table with an air of confidence, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His steps were firm, the slight edge of arrogance in his stride revealing his belief that he had everything under control. He barely glanced at Margaret, his gaze more focused on the other tables, before settling his eyes on her. His voice was curt, dismissive. "What's the issue here?" Victor asked, barely bothering to disguise his indifference. Margaret's voice was calm but firm. "I've been sitting here for nearly an hour. My food hasn't arrived, but you've brought me a bill instead. Is this how your restaurant treats its customers?" Victor glanced down at the bill and then back at Margaret, his expression unimpressed. "Well, ma'am, you know this place has a reputation to uphold. We can't just serve anyone off the street." Margaret's gaze sharpened, the slight flicker of understanding in her eyes as she took in his words. It wasn't about the food. It wasn't about her order being misplaced. It was something deeper. Something ingrained in the very foundation of this place. "So, you're saying," Margaret began, her voice quiet but tinged with a quiet fury, "that because of what I'm wearing, you're choosing to deny me service?" Victor met her gaze, unfazed, his tone even more dismissive now. "That's not what I'm saying at all, but we do reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, you know." Margaret stood taller, her presence somehow filling the space, making everything feel heavier. She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't show warmth but something far colder. "Let me speak to your manager." Victor hesitated for a moment, the arrogance in his posture wavering ever so slightly. "Sure, whatever." He turned away to call across the room, his voice loud, almost too loud, "Danny, get over here, we got a situation with this lady." Margaret remained seated, her hand gently resting on the edge of the table, her fingers still as stone. She wasn't in a rush. No, today was a day for lessons. 5 minutes passed, and then the door to the restaurant swung open again, this time with a subtle, commanding force. A tall man entered, dressed impeccably in a sharp, tailored suit that almost glowed under the restaurant's soft lighting. His presence immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room, and a hush fell over the patrons. Margaret looked up as he walked toward her. She felt no surprise. She had already known he would come. "Mr. Stone," the man said, his voice warm, yet there was something in his tone that made everyone stop and listen. His eyes locked onto hers, his expression changing as recognition flickered behind his gaze. He rushed over, his voice suddenly urgent, "Why didn't you tell me you were coming? I would have arranged a private table for you." The room was still. The man was Ethan Stone, Margaret's son. Tessa and Victor exchanged confused glances. Neither of them recognized the weight of the situation, nor did they understand the full implications of the mistake they had made. Ethan Stone was a titan in the business world. Known for his sharp mind and his ability to build connections that most could only dream of, he was a name that commanded respect. And now, standing before them, he was about to teach a lesson they would never forget. "I don't think you understand, Victor," Ethan said coolly, his gaze never leaving the manager's face. "This isn't just about an order. This is about respect." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. "You've shown my mother none. And you've shown everyone else in this restaurant that this is a place where appearances matter more than decency." Victor's face turned pale. Tessa's earlier smugness vanished completely. They both knew, with a sinking feeling, that they had just made a grave mistake. Ethan's voice cut through the silence. "Tessa, Victor, I hope you've learned something today. But if you haven't," he continued, his gaze piercing, "I'll make sure you do. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working in the back, with the dishwashers. Maybe you'll learn what real work looks like." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "And I'll be checking in." Unannounced. The restaurant was silent. The lesson had been taught. As Margaret stood to leave, she met Ethan's gaze, her eyes warm but knowing. He had done what needed to be done. The staff, once arrogant, now stood humbled, their faces a mix of fear and realization. The silence in the restaurant hung heavy, and as Margaret walked toward the exit, she knew that this wouldn't be the last time the world would learn her true worth. Ethan turned to the staff, his voice cold and final, "Remember this. How you treat people matters. Respect isn't given based on how they look or how much money they have. It's about who they are." With that, he followed his mother out of the restaurant, leaving behind a stunned, humbled crew that would never forget the lesson they had learned today. As Ethan and Margaret walked out of Willow's Steakhouse, the tension in the air slowly dissolved, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. The restaurant, once filled with chatter and the clinking of silverware, now stood still, every patron and staff member aware of the lesson they had just been forced to witness. Outside, the cool night air greeted them as they exited the restaurant. Margaret paused for a moment, her hands folded in front of her. She turned to Ethan, her eyes soft yet proud. "I didn't want to make a scene, but sometimes, Ethan, people need to understand that respect isn't just a privilege. It's a right." Ethan smiled, his expression both thoughtful and resolute. "I know, Mom. You taught me that. And today, I had to remind them." Margaret nodded, a gentle smile crossing her face. "You did more than that. You showed them what true power is, the ability to treat others with dignity, no matter who they are or how they look." As they walked off into the night, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over them. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through the unwavering strength of standing up for what was right. The story of Margaret, Tessa, Victor, and Ethan is a powerful reminder that respect is not earned through wealth or appearance, but through character. No one should ever be judged based on their outward appearance or status. True power lies in treating others with kindness, fairness, and empathy, regardless of their social standing. Whether you're in a position of influence or simply navigating daily life, the lesson remains clear: how we treat others is what truly defines us, not our wealth or what others think of us. And just as Ethan Stone showed, sometimes it takes standing up for the silent, the overlooked, and the misunderstood to restore balance and teach those around us the value of respect.